this is Katie with Crafting with Katie, and today I'm going to show you how I created this welded card in Cricut Design Space. So once you're in Cricut Design Space, the first thing you want to do is click on Insert Images. And I went ahead and chose my images so I wouldn't have to pay for anything. And the first thing I searched for was a rectangle, and you can use any rectangle, you just want a very plain rectangle. So I went down and found a simple one that was from the Don Juan cartridge, and I selected that. Then I went and searched for cupcakes, and I went ahead and chose this image that I found from the Doodle Charms cartridge, and you could choose this one or if you find something that you like that's similar. And I chose that and inserted both images onto my mat. So the next thing I did was I set a canvas. So I knew I was going to be making a 4 1/4 by a 5 1/2 inch card. So I selected the canvas and then changed the orientation to vertical. And that just kind of worked as a guide for me to make this card. So I pulled the rectangle aside, and then since I wanted the cupcakes to be 5 1/2 inches wide, I selected them, and then I changed the width to 5.5 inches. And then the canvas is really nice because then it makes it easy to line up the cupcakes at the bottom, and you know you're kind of setting everything up correctly. Now for the rectangle, I set that at 5 1/2 inches wide as well. And then I was able to drag that up and line it up with the top of the canvas. So my goal here is to kind of line up the cupcakes at the bottom and the rectangle at the top so that the bottom of the card would follow the shape of the cupcakes, but you wouldn't see the rectangle anymore. So I'm just making sure that I have the rectangle really lined up at the top of the canvas. And now here's where these X and Y coordinates come up really handy. If you can kind of take a look at those, and I noticed my X coordinate was at 1.55 inches. So I was able to make sure that I had my cupcakes also lined up at 1.55 inches, and that would make sure that everything's lined up perfectly. So the next step is to make sure that I have the rectangle lined up in a way where you're not going to see any of it falling down below the cupcakes. And this is where it got a little tricky because the cupcakes are not lined up perfectly. They're a little bit at a slant. So what I had to do was go through and actually kind of make a second rectangle so that it would look just perfect and you wouldn't see the edge of the rectangle or a little piece missing. So I just copied and pasted the original rectangle. And then with the second rectangle, I went ahead and got that X coordinate again at 1.55 inches, so it was lined up just right. And then the Y coordinate I noticed was at 1 inch, so it's right on top of the first one. And then all I had to do was just drag over that right side, so just make a really thin, narrow rectangle, and then pull down the bottom so it was just down over the frosting of that first cupcake, because that's the part that was missing on that first rectangle. Then by holding down the Shift key and clicking on the second rectangle and then right-clicking and choosing Weld, the two rectangles are welded together to make this funky looking shape, which is just perfect. So now I'm moving that to the back, and you can see the cupcakes now work perfectly on top of the shape. So now it's time to work with the cupcakes. The first thing I did was right-click on them and chose Ungroup. And so that was so I could work with all of the different layers. For some reason when I did that, that middle piece of frosting tilted, which actually did make a difference for what I was going to do. So I just rotated and got it back in position. The candle didn't matter, but the frosting did because I did something special with that later, which you would see. So the next thing was to go ahead and to work with that background, kind of the wrappers, because that was the part that I needed to weld to the card base. So I pulled that aside, and then I right-clicked on it so that I could copy it and then paste it. And that just made a second copy of it, because that is what needed to be welded over to that rectangle shape I created to make the card base. So by holding down the shift key, I was able to click on the cupcakes and then that rectangle shape. And before that, I first did go ahead and make sure I was lined up just perfectly with that X coordinate of 1.55 inches. And then I was able to weld them together. So you can see now I have that card base with the cupcake shape at the bottom. And the width is exactly 5.5 inches. The height is a little less than 8.5 inches, but we're talking hundredths of an inch, so that doesn't matter. So before I cut this, I just pulled apart the flames and the candles. They were all set to go. And the one thing that I did need to work with was the frosting, because Doodle Charms was an older cartridge, and the way it was created was that the little sprinkles cut out separately, which is kind of a pain if you remember working with these types of cartridges. Those little sprinkles were so teeny tiny. The later cartridges were created in a different way that made it much easier to work with. So I decided to kind of change the way the frosting was and the sprinkles to make it more like those later cartridges. So the way I did this was I took each of the frostings and I made a copy of the frosting itself to make it as a background layer. So that's what I'm just doing right here. And then after that, I was able to go through and take the original layer that had the sprinkles on it and group together the sprinkles with the frosting and make that be like the foreground layer. So instead of having to glue on all of these teeny little sprinkles, I was left with like a layer that had the sprinkles cut out, and then the color of the sprinkles would show through on the layer beneath it. So for example, on this one right here, I'm welding together like the green sprinkles on the pink frosting. So that other pink frosting below it, I could cut out in green, and that was where the green color would show through. And so for this one, I'm cutting out these little yellow holes on the chocolate frosting. If you see the chocolate frosting below it, if I cut that out in yellow, that's where the yellow would show through. And it just makes it a lot easier when assembling the cut. So just saving a little time. I really like how the later creators of the Cricut cartridges changed it to that style. Saves us a lot of time. So in this one, I just, one of them did not group with me, and I was trying to drag it, and I stretched it, and thank goodness for the undo button. It's always helpful. And then sometimes you go to drag something and it disappears, and it just means it got moved behind it. So you can always go up to the arrange button and move something to the front or something to the back to help you find it, and then there it is, it popped back up. So to remember to group something, you just hold down your shift button and click on everything you want to select, and then with your right mouse button you can choose group. So now everything was ready to cut out, and I was able to choose the patterns that I wanted and then put this card together, and this was the final product.